Defending the Earth, a dialogue between Murray Bookchin and Dave Foreman, published by South End Press, Boston, Massachusetts, 1991. Introduction. Whither the Radical Ecology Movement. By Steve Chase. Since at least as far back as 1866, when the German biologist Ernest Haeckel coined the term ecology, scientific ecologists have repeatedly split into different camps in how they view the question of humanity's proper place and role within nature. According to historian Donald Worster, one might very well cast the history of ecology as a struggle between rival views of the relationship between humans and nature, one view devoted to the discovery of intrinsic value and its preservation, the other to the creation of an instrumentalized world and its exploitation. Note. Donald Worster, Nature's Economy, A History of Ecological Ideas, New York, Cambridge University Press, 1977, 11. End note. It should come as no surprise then that this same philosophical conflict splits the ranks of today's political activists who seek to reshape our society's relations with the rest of the natural world along more ecological lines. In his recent book, Green Political Thought, English author Andrew Dobson draws an important distinction between light green reform environmentalism and dark green radical ecologism. According to Dobson, conventional environmentalism represents an instrumental, imperial approach to nature that argues that our environmental problems, however serious, can be solved without fundamental changes in present values or patterns of production and consumption. Radical ecologism, in contrast, raises the ethical ideal of a beloved eco-community and argues that care for the environment presupposes radical changes in our relationship with it, and in our mode of social and political life. Note. Andrew Dobson, Green Political Thought, London, Unwin Hyman, 1990, 13. End note. This difference in political orientation, while perhaps not yet obvious to the general public, is not news to most people who are actively concerned with ecological politics today. The distinction between reform environmentalism and radical political ecologism was first made over 25 years ago. This book's co-author, Murray Bookchin, was among the first to draw attention to this distinction in several pioneering essays during the 1960s and 1970s. As Bookchin has noted, ecologism refers to a broad, philosophical, almost spiritual, outlook toward humanity's relationship to the natural world, not to environmentalism, which is a form of natural engineering that seeks to manipulate nature as mere natural resources with minimal pollution and public outcry. Note. Murray Bookchin, Our Synthetic Environment, New York, Colophon, 1974, 15. End note. In strikingly similar terms, the renowned Norwegian eco-philosopher and activist Arne Næss made the same basic distinction in a 1973 essay contrasting the shallow reform environmental movement with the emerging deep, long-range ecology movement. Note. Arne Næss, The Shallow and the Deep, Long-Range Ecology Movement, a Summary Inquiry No. 16, 1973, 95-100. End note. While this essay did not receive significant attention in the U.S. until 1980, it is now quite common in both activist and academic circles to characterize the central political fault line within the ecology movement as the ideological division between shallow and deep ecologists. For many, deep ecology has become a generic rubric to describe all political ecologists who a. believe that the natural world has an intrinsic value of its own, b. seek to end industrial society's attempted domination of the biosphere, and c. work to radically reconstruct human society along ecological lines. In this very broad sense, social ecologists, ecofeminists, bioregionalists, radical greens, earth firsters, Native American traditionalists, many academic eco-philosophers, and some animal liberationists can all fairly be called deep ecologists. It thus came as a surprise to many ecology activists when Murray Bookchin strongly challenged the political perspective of deep ecology in the summer of 1987 at the Second National Green Gathering at Amherst, Massachusetts. In his keynote address to the conference, Bookchin warned that the academic philosophers of deep ecology, as well as several leading spokespeople for Earth First, the self-proclaimed action wing of deep ecology movement, were guilty of propagating a deeply flawed and potentially dangerous ecological perspective. In that speech, and in several later articles, Bookchin declared that the growing popularity of deep ecology suggests that a major crisis of purpose, conscience, and direction exists in the U.S. ecology movement. Note: Murray Bookchin, Crisis in the Ecology Movement, Z Magazine, July-August 1988, 121. End note. Was Bookchin rejecting his long-standing commitment to radical ecologism? Accustomed to the generic usage of the term deep ecology to describe the whole radical wing of the ecology movement, many activists interpreted the ensuing social versus deep ecology debate as the latest volley between shallow environmentalism, admittedly combined this time with the radical social politics, and a deeper, more radical ecological philosophy, analysis, vision, and strategy. This interpretation, however, ignores the important shift in the meaning of the term deep ecology that occurred between the time Ness first used the term in 1973 and when Bookchin finally challenged the deep ecology perspective. By the mid-1980s, the term deep ecology had increasingly come to mean deep ecology, a very particular, though eclectic, body of ideas developed by academics such as Ness Warwick Fox, George Sessions, and Bill Duvall on the one hand, and by militant wilderness activists in Earth First such as Ed Abbey, Christopher Maines, and Dave Foreman on the other. As Warwick Fox notes, the term deep ecology can therefore be seen as one that does double duty, referring on the one hand to a whole class of approaches, i.e., all non-anthropocentric approaches, and on the other hand to a particular kind of approach within this class, a distinctive kind of approach to non-anthropocentrism. Note: Warwick Fox, Towards a Transpersonal Ecology, Boston, Shambhala, 1990, 75. End note. This distinctive approach is the deep ecology perspective criticized so strenuously by Bookchin. The deep versus social ecology debate is thus not a heated rehash of the old environmentalism/ecologism debate. It is best understood as an intense dialogue across a new philosophical and political fault line that has emerged from within radical ecologism itself. At its heart, the debate between social and deep ecology suggests the existence of differing answers to the question, whether the radical ecology movement. Yet, even among those activists who recognize the novel nature of the debate, many were still surprised at the sharpness of Bookchin's critique of deep ecology. Were social and deep ecology really so far apart? Bookchin himself had long advocated, indeed pioneered, several of the key insights championed by deep ecologists. According to Roderick Nash, a historian of American environmental ethics, Bookchin's theoretical work in social ecology, which began in the early 1950s, contributed greatly to the development of deep ecology in the 1970s and 1980s. Note: Roderick Nash, The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics, Madison, University of Wisconsin Press, 1989, 164-65. End note. Indeed, one of Bookchin's essays on nature philosophy was included in the first anthology on deep ecology published in the United States, and he was prominently quoted as a deep ecology pioneer in the popular Deep Ecology Manifesto written by George Sessions and Bill Duvall a year later in 1985. Note: Michael Tobias, ed., Deep Ecology, San Marcos, Avant Books, 1984, Bill Duvall and George Sessions, Deep Ecology, Living as If Nature Mattered, Salt Lake City, Peregrine Smith Books, 1985. End note. As Christopher Maines has noted, up until the U.S. Green Gathering in 1987, Bookchin's works often received high praise in deep ecology literature. Note: Christopher Maines, Green Rage, Radical Environmentalism and the Unmaking of Civilization, Boston, Little Brown and Company, 1990, 154. End note. Few activists familiar with the literature on radical ecological philosophy would disagree that there are some significant differences in the philosophical origins, strategic focuses, and primary concerns of social and deep ecology. Yet most, at least up until the Green Gathering in Amherst, felt that these differences were not a significant problem. Unity in diversity is a basic attribute of healthy eco-communities. Why shouldn't it be a healthy characteristic for the radical ecology movement? In his Amherst speech, Bookchin posed the question of whether these differences were, or could become, complementary, or whether the two schools of thought were fundamentally, and inevitably antagonistic. After reflecting on the work of several academic deep ecologists and on the published statements of a few Earth First activists, Bookchin decided that deep and social ecology were fundamentally antagonistic after all. His assessment, put in its simplest terms, was that deep ecology was not just a radical pro-nature philosophy, but that it was potentially, and, in some cases, explicitly, anti-social and anti-human. Bookchin's critique was soon answered by several people in the deep ecology movement, and the resulting debate, as well as back-and-forth charges of misanthropy and anthropocentrism, quickly spilled over into the pages of Earth First, The Nation, Utne Reader, Z Magazine, The Guardian, Socialist Review, Environmental Ethics, Mother Jones, Green Perspectives, Our Generation, Whole Earth Review, Green Letter, Omni, The New York Times, and popular books like Christopher Maney's Green Rage. Over the last few years, the debate has increasingly become a lively topic of discussion in movement circles. Perhaps never before has there been such a widespread political debate in the United States on the interrelationship between environmental ethics, nature philosophy, and radical social theory. Unfortunately, until the face-to-face meeting between Dave Foreman and Murray Bookchin that provides the core of this book, the debate frequently tended to generate more heat than light. A number of grassroots ecology activists have been dismayed by the hostile, almost sectarian, nature of the debate. Some blame Bookchin and the social ecologists, who have admittedly offered fierce and sweeping criticisms. Bookchin, for instance, characterized some of the leading lights of Earth First as barely disguised racists, survivalists, macho Daniel Boones, and outright social reactionaries. Foreman was perhaps the most frequent target of Bookchin's wrath. In his speech at Amherst, Bookchin called Foreman a patently anti-humanist and macho mountain man guilty of a crude eco-brutalism. Note: Murray Bookchin, Social Ecology vs. Deep Ecology, Burlington, Green Program Project, 1988, 4. End note. Others blame deep ecologists for the rancorous, all-or-nothing, tone of the debate. While Dave Foreman largely avoided critical outbursts and name-calling, naturalist writer Ed Abbey, the literary inspiration of Earth First, publicly called Bookchin a fat old lady and declared that he didn't care if that sounded sexist. Note: Edward Abbey, U.N.C.L.E., Utne Reader, March-April 1988, 7. End note. In a somewhat more civil response, Bill Duvall publicly reversed his earlier opinion of Bookchin's work and started characterizing social ecology as just another old paradigm leftist ideology that falls far short of a genuinely ecological philosophy. Note: Bill Duvall, simple in means, rich in ends, practicing deep ecology, Salt Lake City, Peregrine Smith Books, 1988, 136. End note. Christopher Maney's went so far as to charge Bookchin with a Faustian ambition to seize control of evolution and dominate nature. Note: Christopher Maney's, 160. End note. Several rank-and-file activists responded to the intense and often angry tone of this debate with a plague on both your house's weariness and treated it as little more than an intellectual cockfight without serious political substance. Yet most activists realize that, regardless of the relative merit of the rhetorical fireworks, some very real and important issues are at stake here, issues that need to be explored and resolved one way or another if the radical ecology movement is going to play a creative and influential role within our society in the years ahead. Back in 1982, Roderick Nash observed that two different visions have emerged within the radical ecology movement over the last 2 or 3 decades. Nash calls these different radical ecological scenarios the wilderness vision and the garden vision. Note: Roderick Nash, Wilderness and the American Mind, New Haven, Yale University Press, 1982, 379-388. End note. If he were to write about these differing visions today, he might well connect these different visionary alternatives to deep ecology and social ecology. While these different visions are not necessarily mutually exclusive, they have, up to now, rarely been well integrated, and they have frequently been formulated in extreme, near-exclusive ways. This extremism may well be the primary source of conflict between proponents of deep and social ecology. Nash, for example, believes that deep ecology wilderness lovers have much to fear from the advocates of the garden vision. As he puts it, quote, "There are two ways of thinking about the end of wilderness on Earth. One might be termed the wasteland scenario. It anticipates a ravaged planet, one which is paved and poisoned to the point that the world dies with T.S. Eliot's celebrated whimper. This nightmare of creeping urbanization traditionally fired the protests of nature lovers, conservationists, and preservationists. It could still occur, especially given the increase of technological capability, but the greatest long-term threat to the interests of people who covet the wild may reside in the garden scenario. It too ends wilderness, but beneficently rather than destructively. René Dubos points the way with his vision of a bounteous, stable and, to many tastes, beautiful earth that is totally modified. In a garden earth, the fertility of the soil is not only maintained but enhanced. Fruit trees support songbirds. Carefully managed streams run clear and pure. The air is unpolluted. Forests provide an endless supply of wood. Large cities are rare as people decentralize into the hinterland. Many live on self-sufficient family farms. The animals permitted to exist are safe and useful. A softer variety of technology enables people to live gracefully and gratefully as part of the natural community. There is a minimum of pavement, cows dot the meadows, democracy thrives, and the kids have healthy faces. It is an appealing vision whose roots run back through Thomas Jefferson's deification of the yeoman farmer to the Garden of Eden." End quote. Note: Ebedum, 380. End note. At first glance, at least, the garden scenario described by Nash bears more than a passing resemblance to the utopian vision of social ecology. Murray Bookchin, after all, described microbiologist René Dubos in 1974 as an important early social ecology thinker. Note: Murray Bookchin, Our Synthetic Environment, 14. End note. While Bookchin's and Dubos' views were far from identical even then, their visions for the humanly inhabited portions of the Earth did overlap significantly. Bookchin, however, expressed himself in much more radical terms. Following Peter Kropotkin, the visionary 19th-century anarchist geographer, Bookchin has argued that we need to transform our oppressive industrial capitalist society into an ecological society based on non-hierarchical relationships, decentralized democratic communities, and eco-technologies like solar power, organic agriculture, and humanly scaled industries. Note: Murray Bookchin, Remaking Society, Pathways to a Green Future, Boston, South End Press, 1990, 155. End note. According to Bookchin, decentralized forms of production and food cultivation tailored to the carrying capacities of particular bioregions are not only more efficient and ecologically sustainable, they also restore humanity's intimate contact with soil, plant and animal life, sun, and wind. This, he believes, is the only way to fully anchor and sustain a widespread ecological sensibility within our culture. Furthermore, he maintains that only by challenging the profit-seeking, grow-or-die dynamic of the corporate capitalist economy and creating an alternative economy oriented to ecologically sustainable production to meet vital human needs can we genuinely protect the planet from the ravages of acid rain, global warming, and ozone destruction. Bookchin, of course, is not the only modern radical ecological thinker to draw on Kropotkin. Several writers, including some deep ecologists, have echoed Kropotkin's eco-anarchist ideas of communitarian democracy, deurbanization, industrial decentralization, alternative technology, organic agriculture, limits to growth, and a renewed naturalist sensibility. Social ecology, however, is the body of ideas that has most self-consciously built on this eco-anarchist foundation and further developed and elaborated a workable vision of an ecological society. In doing so, social ecology makes an enormous contribution to the radical ecology movement, one which is neglected at our peril. Earth First activist Judy Berry is sadly ill-informed when she maintains that the contours of an ecological society are not spoken to in any leftist theory. Note: Judy Berry, Expand Earth First, September 22, 1990, 5. End note. Important questions remain, however. What do social ecologists have to say about the remaining wilderness areas of the planet that are increasingly encroached on and destroyed by our expansionary industrial society? Will wilderness be valued and allowed to flourish in the social ecology vision of the future? Are social ecologists fully sensitive to the call of environmental ethics beyond the moral imperative to provide a sustainable, healthy, beautiful, and productive natural environment for all members of the human community? If we take Dubose as the definitive social ecologist, the answer is clearly numbered. Towards the end of his life, Dubose adopted a very exclusive and totalistic version of the garden vision and advocated humanizing and managing the entire surface of the planet. His vision, as Nash points out, was of a planet totally modified, albeit prudently and carefully, by human intervention. Dubose was, in fact, quite open about the consequences of his perspective. As he put it, the humanization of Earth inevitably results in destruction of wilderness and of many living species that depend on it. Note: René Dubose, The Wooing of Earth, London, Athlone Press, 1980, 1. End note. This is seen by Dubose as an acceptable price to pay as we move the planet toward a new stage of humanly managed natural evolution. Deep ecologists are quite right to criticize this extremist version of the garden vision. It does represent a form of anthropocentric, albeit sustainable hubris. In sharp contrast, however, Murray Bookchin has never embraced such a one-sided garden vision. While some of Bookchin's deep ecology critics have repeatedly tried to paint Bookchin's views as if they were identical to those of Dubose, such charges are very wide of the mark. Note: See, for example, Robin Eckersley, Divining Evolution, The Ecological Ethics of Murray Bookchin, Environmental Ethics, No. 11, 1989, 99-116. For Bookchin's challenge to this characterization of his views, see Murray Bookchin, Recovering Evolution, a reply to Eckersley and Fox, Environmental Ethics, No. 12, 1990, 253-274. End note. In his most important philosophical work, The Ecology of Freedom, Bookchin adamantly rejects the vision of a completely domesticated and pacified planet, calling instead for an appreciation of a high degree of natural spontaneity and urging caution in disturbing natural processes. Note: Murray Bookchin, The Ecology of Freedom, Palo Alto, Cheshire Books, 1982, 24. End note. Furthermore, since as far back as the 1960s, Bookchin has repeatedly asserted that one of the essential goals of social ecology is to guard and expand wilderness areas and domains for wildlife. Note: Murray Bookchin, Toward an Ecological Society, Montreal, Black Rose, 1984, 44. End note. Significantly, Bookchin bases his views on ethical as well as practical grounds. Unlike reform environmentalism, says Bookchin, social ecology sees the balance and integrity of the biosphere as an end in itself. Note: Ebedam, 59. End note. Natural diversity, he says, is to be cultivated not only because the more diversified the components that make up an ecosystem, The more stable the ecosystem, diversity is also desirable for its own sake, a value to be cherished as part of a spiritized notion of the living universe. Note. Ebedam, 59. End note. Other social ecologists, such as John Clarke, have echoed Bookchin's non-anthropocentric approach to environmental ethics and argued the need for humanity to situate its good within the larger context of the planetary good. Note. John Clarke ed., Renewing the Earth, The Promise of Social Ecology, London, Green Print, 1990, 7. For an expanded treatment of Clarke's approach to environmental ethics, see his essay Ecology, Technology and Respect for Nature in John Clarke, The Anarchist Moment, Reflections on Culture, Nature, and Power, Montreal, Black Rose 1984, 191-199. End note. Bookchin's and Clarke's views on wilderness and environmental ethics are very different from Dubbo's. Philosopher Thomas Berry has argued that it is best to call Dubbo's approach humanist ecology and to clearly distinguish it from social ecology. Note. Thomas Berry, The World of René Dubbo's, Amicus Journal, Winter 1991, 52. End note. Bookchin would no doubt agree. He has certainly never drawn another connection between Dubbo's and social ecology since his comment in 1974. Dubbo's, himself, likely distinguished his position from Bookchin's. Significantly, he never identified himself as a social ecologist in any of his books. It should come as no surprise then that very few social ecologists actively embrace Dubbo's extreme anti-wilderness garden vision. Yet, at the same time, it is also true that many social ecologists do not fully appreciate or share Bookchin's long-standing commitment to non-anthropocentric ethic and nature philosophy. Bookchin's position on these questions is very influential in social ecology circles, but it is far from a movement-wide norm. In theory and practice, many social ecology activists fall somewhere between Bookchin's more radical philosophical perspective and the more conventional and anthropocentric approach of the later Dubbo's. Note. For a critical examination of one social ecologist's anthropocentric environmental ethic, see Steve Chase Beyond Sustainability, What Green Activists Can and Can't Learn From. See George Bonello, in Julian Bonello et. ALEDS, From the Ground Up, Essays on Grassroots and Workplace Democracy, Boston, South End Press, forthcoming. End note. Like Bookchin and the early Dubbo's, nearly all social ecologists believe that both the humanized landscape and the wilderness have a place in any desired ecological future. Note. René Dubbo's, So Human and Animal, New York, Scribner's, 1968, 206. End note. However, like the later Dubbo's, many social ecologists often experience ambivalent attitudes regarding the comparative merits and rights of the wilderness and humanized environments. Note. René Dubbo's, The Wooing of Earth, 134. End note. Not surprisingly, given the strong anthropocentric bias of the dominant culture as well as of conventional Marxist and anarchist theory, many social ecology activists unconsciously resolve this ambivalence by excessively privilege the needs and desires of human societies over the interests of other life forms, mixed and wilderness communities. While perhaps not as extreme as Dubbo's, there is an identifiable extremist garden tendency within social ecology circles. This tendency has inhibited the social ecology movement as a whole from developing a non-native perspective that holistically integrates radical garden and wilderness visions. This situation calls into question John Clarke's claim that social ecology represents a highly developed approach to all the central issues of theory and practice in ecological philosophy and politics. Note. John Clarke ed., Renewing the Earth, 5. End note. For all of his commitment at the philosophical level to integrating a wilderness vision with his highly developed social vision of a humane and ecological society, even Bookchin has never provided a sustained and searching exploration of how and why to practically restore the balance between town, country, and wilderness. His primary intellectual focus, like that of other socially oriented ecological thinkers of his generation such as Lewis Mumford, E. F. Schumacher, E. A. Gutkind, and Wendell Berry, has always been on restoring the social and ecological balance between town and country, the humanly inhabited portions of the planet. Bookchin is not alone in leaving this element of social ecology theory relatively undeveloped. Elaborating a detailed and radical vision and strategy for wilderness preservation has, to date, never taken center stage in any work in the literature of social ecology. In John Clarke's recent anthology of social ecology writings, for example, there is not a single article on wilderness preservation. Note: Ibidem. This oversight on the part of a 1990 anthology which attempts to show how the philosophy of social ecology expresses in a comprehensive, richly developed, and profound manner the deepest strivings of the Green Movement is quite glaring. End note. Nor has conservation biology and the preservation and restoration of wilderness ever been a part of the curriculum at the Institute for Social Ecology. It would appear then, that for all of social ecology's wisdom about creating a humane and ecological society, and for all of Bookchin's commitment to a non-anthropocentric nature philosophy, social ecology's practical day-to-day commitment to wilderness preservation has never been fully developed, and its vision has only rarely exceeded the limited wilderness vision of the mainstream conservation movement. Whatever else can be said about him, Dave Foreman, the other co-author of this book, has clearly thought long and hard about wilderness. In this respect, he represents a radical alternative to the relatively undeveloped wilderness vision of social ecology. Indeed, since the founding of Earth First by Foreman and 4 other disgruntled wilderness activists in 1980, Foreman and the others have launched a powerful philosophical attack on the impoverished wilderness vision of the mainstream conservation movement. In terms as sharp and stinging as Bookchin's critique of deep ecology, Earth First co-founder Howie Wolk publicly charged that the reformist conservation movement was guilty of raging moderation, irresponsible compromise, knee-jerk Sierra Club dogma, and unknowing, sometimes knowing, duplicity in the systematic destruction of wilderness. Note. Quoted in Christopher Maney's, 66. End note. Foreman went so far as to argue that the worldview of the then executive director of the Sierra Club is closer to that of James Watt or Ronald Reagan than to Earth First's. Note. Quoted in Ibidem, 225. End note. To these deep ecologists, the tepid wilderness vision projected by the mainstream conservation movement, as well as by several social ecologists, amounts to little more than preserving a few minor ecological museums in hard-to-develop places, maintaining numerous small wildlife sanctuaries, and protecting some rugged outdoor recreational resorts. In sharp contrast, the deep ecology movement embraces the more radical wilderness commitments of Henry David Thoreau, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and Bob Marshall. In June 1983, Dave Foreman and 2 other Earth First founders unveiled the visionary centerpiece of their environmental defense program, a proposal called the Wilderness Preserve System, which seeks to declare over 50 large wilderness areas in North America off-limits to industrial human civilization as preserves for the free flow of natural processes. Note. Quoted in Rick Scarce, Eco Warriors, Understanding the Radical Environmental Movement, Chicago, Noble Press, 1990, 66. End note. This detailed plan, covering over 716 million acres, was conceived as one component of a larger vision to restore an ecological balance between town, country, and wilderness by protecting all remaining roadless public lands over a few thousand acres. As Christopher Maney's reports, these large preserves would allow, quote, no human habitation, except, in some cases, indigenous peoples with traditional lifestyles, no use of mechanized equipment or vehicles, no roads, no logging, mining, water diversion, industrial activity, agriculture, or grazing, no use of artificial chemical substances, no suppression of wildfires, no overflights by aircraft, and no priority given to the safety and convenience of human visitors over the functioning of the ecosystem. End quote. Note. Christopher Maney's, 74. End note. This stringent plan, already a reform conservationist's nightmare, does not limit itself to protecting ecological communities within existing national parks and forests, however. The plan boldly goes on to call for the inclusion of large areas of privately owned and even already developed land which could be carefully restored by conservation biologists into a more wild state suitable for inclusion under the preserve system. While never believing that their proposal was an acceptable legislative initiative within the current political context, Earth First pushed the preserve plan to clearly distinguish itself from reformist environmentalists and to force people to come to terms with its radical ecological vision. Indeed, no group in history, with the exception of the Native Americans who resisted the European invasion of this continent, has ever projected such a sweeping vision for preserving wilderness and, as a direct result, containing and rolling back an environmentally destructive industrial civilization. Philosophically, Foreman's vision of big wilderness grows directly out of one of the most basic principles of deep ecology which, as articulated by Ness and Sessions, affirms that the well-being and flourishing of non-human life and its habitat has intrinsic value and should be respected by human beings independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. Note: Arne Ness, Ecology, Community and Lifestyle, New York, Cambridge University Press, 1989, 29. End note. Indeed, most deep ecologists see a commitment to big wilderness as a litmus test of whether someone has firmly adopted a non-anthropocentric ecological ethic that transcends mere environmental pragmatism and enlightened human self-interest. It would be a mistake, however, to think that most deep ecologists are not also mindful of the ecological, scientific, aesthetic, and spiritual benefits of wilderness to human beings and to human civilization. A consistent theme throughout much of the literature, for example, is the cultural value of intimate and respectful human interaction and identification with the wild and its creatures. Following the lead of respected human ecologist Paul Shepard, many deep ecologists point to the growing evidence that psychological and cultural maturity is enhanced and deepened, given our own evolutionary history, by rich wilderness experiences. Note: Shepard's influence is very strong in Bill Duvall and George Sessions' Deep Ecology, particularly in their chapter Culture and Character, 179 to 191. For those who want to go straight to the source, see Paul Shepard, Thinking Animals, Animals and the Development of Human Intelligence, New York, Viking, 1978, and Paul Shepard, Nature and Madness, San Francisco, Sierra Club Books, 1982. End note. As deep ecology poet and essayist Gary Snyder warns, a culture that alienates itself from the wilderness outside and from that other wilderness, the wilderness within, is doomed to a very destructive behavior, ultimately perhaps self-destructive behavior. Note: quoted in Roderick Nash, Wilderness and the American Mind, 253. End note. While deep ecology philosophy does tend to focus primarily on wilderness, it is not necessarily unaware or unconcerned with the ecological and social concerns of human civilization, a fact that has sometimes been lost in Bookchin's critique. Some deep ecologists, in fact, are as concerned as social ecologists with radical social transformation and creating decentralized, non-hierarchical, and democratic bioregional human communities with a dynamic steady-state economy based on eco-technologies and ecologically sound production and consumption practices. As Gary Snyder puts it, if humanity is to remain on Earth, it must transform the 5 millennia-long urbanizing civilization tradition into a new ecologically sensitive, harmony-oriented, wild-minded scientific/spiritual culture. Nothing short of total transformation will do much good. Note: quoted in E. Beadham, 252. End note. However, this integration of wilderness and garden visions is not necessarily the norm. Just like their nemesis René Dubos, deep ecologists often experience very ambivalent attitudes regarding the comparative merits and rights of the wilderness and of humanized environments. It is telling that some deep ecologists have chanted down with human beings, around campfires at Earth First gatherings. This is, as Dave Foreman has put it, an honest expression of some deep ecologists' perspective. Note: Dave Foreman, Wither Earth First, Earth First November 1st, 1987, 21. Endnote. The wilderness vision can clearly be stretched to exclusive, anti-human, anti-social extremes. Indeed, what first sparked Bookchin's alarm about deep ecology was the publication of remarks by a handful of influential deep ecology wilderness activists which showed a callous disregard for human life and a serious ignorance of the underlying social roots of the global ecological crisis. As Bookchin has noted, the wilderness vision, taken to extremes, has a less innocent side. Quote, "It can lead to a rejection of human nature, an introverted denial of social intercourse, a needless opposition between wilderness and civilization, and a revolt against one's own kind, indeed, a disclaiming of natural evolution as it is embodied in human beings. This pitting of a seemingly wild first nature against social second nature reflects a blind and tortured inability to distinguish what is irrational and anti-ecological in capitalist society from what could be rational and ecological in a free society." End quote. Note. Murray Bookchin, Remaking Society 153. End note. In contrast to social ecologists, who trace the roots of the ecological crisis to the rise of hierarchical and exploitative human societies, many deep ecology activists talk of the human species itself as a blight on the planet. As Dave Foreman has put it, it is time for a warrior society to rise up out of the earth and throw itself in front of the juggernaut of destruction, to be antibodies against the human pox that's ravaging this precious beautiful planet. Note. Quoted in Christopher Maney's, 84. End note. Given this analysis, the primary long-term goal of many deep ecologists is not transforming society but rather drastically depopulating the earth as if human numbers were all that mattered and the various kinds of societies that people can create are of little or no relevance to the ecological question. While never advocating active genocide, more than a few deep ecology activists have seriously talked of letting nature take its course in depopulating the earth and have openly counseled people to do nothing to avert such natural disasters as famine or epidemic disease. More than one prominent deep ecologist has even advocated active measures such as militarily closing the U.S.-Mexican border to stem the tide of immigrants from Latin America, whom Ed Abbey once described as morally culturally generically inferior people. Note. Edward Abbey, One Life at a Time, Please, New York Henry Holt, 1988, 43. End note. All of this has led to a number of feminist and anti-racist critiques of such positions within the ecology movement by such ecological writers as Marty Keel, Innistra King, Janet Beale, Carl Anthony, and the many authors of We Speak for Ourselves, Social Justice, Race, and Environment. Note. Marty Keel, Ecofeminism and Deep Ecology in Irene Diamond and Gloria Fernan-Orenstein, eds, Rewebbing the World, The Emergence of Ecofeminism, San Francisco, Sierra Club Books, 1990, 128-154, Innistra King, Coming of Age with the Greens, Z Magazine, February 1988, 18-19, Janet Beale, It's Deep, but Is It Broad? An Ecofeminist Looks at Deep Ecology. Kick It Over, Special Supplement, Date Unknown, Carl Anthony Why Blacks Should Be Environmentalists, in Brad Erickson, ed., Call to Action, A Handbook for Ecology, Peace and Justice, San Francisco, Sierra Club Books, 1990, 144-145, Dana Alston, ed., We Speak for Ourselves, Social Justice, Race, and Environment, Washington, Panos Institute 1991. End note. While not necessarily the norm, there is clearly a misanthropic strain within the more extreme wilderness visions articulated by some deep ecologists. This blunts the social perspective and ethic of the entire movement and its members. Indeed, the deep ecology movement as a whole lacks a consistent or clear social analysis of the ecology crisis or even a consistent commitment to humane social ethics. Anarchistic ecotopian visions coexist with potentially chilling and authoritarian perspectives as well as calls to completely unmake civilization and return to hunter and gatherer societies everywhere on the planet. Dave Foreman is perhaps one of the best individual examples of this wide range of deep ecology social thought. Contrary to countless criticisms of him, however, Foreman has most often embraced a radical bioregional social vision as his chosen goal for the humanly inhabited portions of the Earth. Note: Dave Foreman, Re-inhabitation, Biocentrism, and Self-Defense, Earth First, August 1, 1987, 22. End note. At other times, however, his social thinking has been much more accommodating to the status quo, as if he actually believed that the Earth's remaining wilderness areas could be successfully protected long-term without replacing the industrial capitalist social system. In his book Eco-Defense, A Field Guide to Monkey Wrenching, for example, Foreman emphatically asserts that direct action efforts such as Earth Firsts do not aim to overthrow any social, political, or economic system. Note: Dave Foreman, Eco-Defense, A Field Guide to Monkey Wrenching, Tucson, Ned Ludd Books, 1989, 16. End note. Even more troubling are a few of Foreman's past comments, particularly those on immigration and famine, which suggest an icy indifference to human suffering similar to the oppressive sensibilities of the very power elites that Foreman has, at other times, called the thugs who run modern civilization. Note: Dave Foreman interview by Bill Duvall, in Simple Living, Volume 2, Number 12, 1986. End note. Foreman's occasional calls for a return to the Pleistocene also suggest a wholesale and uncritical rejection of agriculture, technology, natural science, and humanist social philosophy. Foreman's personal confusion over these social questions and his occasional flirtation with the reactionary and extremist wilderness vision in the name of deep ecology could perhaps be dismissed as an aberration, but such positions have been repeated or allowed to go unchallenged by many other deep ecology activists and thinkers. Given this situation, it is little wonder that some deep ecologists adopt an even more profoundly anti-human, exclusive version of the wilderness vision and routinely sacrifice fragile social ethics in the name of enhancing our environmental ethics. Social ecologists offer an important and needed alternative to these anti-human extremes within deep ecology philosophy and social thought. For one thing, all social ecologists believe that human aspirations for creating healthy and democratic human communities are legitimate moral concerns in and of themselves, and a vital interest of our species. In contrast, deep ecologists have very mixed views on the moral legitimacy of these human-centered concerns. While key philosophers in both radical tendencies agree on the limits of an exclusive, anthropocentric concern for human beings, social ecologists take the humanistic aspect of their politics very seriously. Most believe that the radical ecology movement ought to articulate and resolutely support a non-anthropocentric, ecological humanism as one essential aspect of its larger moral vision. The other key insight that social ecology offers to the radical ecology movement is its emphasis on the historic and organic connection between social hierarchy and the ecological crisis. Perhaps the most basic principle of social ecology today is that the social factor most underlying the destructive relationship between human societies and the rest of the natural world is the historic breakdown of community solidarity within early human societies and the resulting expansion of hierarchy domination and exploitation within the global human community. This social history, argues Bookchin, has profoundly conditioned the way we experience reality as a whole, including nature and non-human life forms. Note: Murray Bookchin, Remaking Society 46. End note. Historically, this conditioning fosters anthropocentrism and encourages the very idea of dominating nature. Given this analysis, it is inconceivable to social ecologists that ecology activists can effectively defend the Earth, in any long-term fashion, if they leave the tapeworm of human oppression firmly embedded within the very guts of our society. For Bookchin and other social ecologists, wilderness preservation, even on the scale proposed by Earth First, is not nearly radical enough. They argue instead that the essential task, if we are to defend the Earth successfully, is not simply to try to contain ecologically destructive societies but to ultimately and fundamentally transform them. Can common ground be found between these two wings of the radical ecology movement? When the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested Dave Foreman on trumped-up charges of terrorism in 1989, it became clear that the radical ecology movement is now under heavy official attack. The need for a principled unity among all the wings of the movement, regardless of their continuing differences, became increasingly obvious. In order to counter the traditional divide-and-conquer tactics of the FBI, Bookchin and Foreman accepted the Learning Alliance's long-standing invitation for a joint public meeting in order to show their solidarity, acknowledge the common ground that could be found between them, and explore their philosophical and political differences in a way that showed that deep ecologists and social ecologists can listen to and learn from each other. The result, as revealed in this book, is a remarkable and thought-provoking rejection of the extremes of both the wilderness and garden visions and a move toward a genuinely integrated radical vision. Not all their differences were resolved, of course. Bookchin and Foreman had to agree to disagree on a number of important topics raised. Yet, the shared contours of an exciting radical ecological politics that integrates the best of the garden and wilderness visions was clear for all to see. This is an important victory for the radical ecology movement. It reflects the significant movement away from one-sided programs and strategies on the part of many deep and social ecologists. It is heartening, for example, to hear a prominent deep ecologist like Bill Duvall finally acknowledge that Marxist, socialist, and anarchist perspectives can help deep ecologists explore and understand the political and social factors, including the role of capitalism and multinational corporations, involved in the degradation of our planet. Note: Bill Duvall, simple in means, rich in ends, 137. End note. It is also encouraging to see new, more socially oriented, leaders emerge in Earth First and to see their efforts to build an environmental alliance with timber workers to save old-growth forests and replace the corporate timber companies with environmentally responsible worker-owned cooperatives. It is equally heartening to see social ecology groups such as the Left Green Network asserting more forcefully than ever that they stand with every struggle for the protection of non-human life, the conservation of species diversity habitats and ecosystems, and the expansion of wilderness areas. Note: Principles of the Left Green Network adopted at the first conference of the Left Green Network, Ames, Iowa, April 21 to 23, 1989. End note. The long-standing social ecology commitment to wilderness is now clearly more than rhetorical. Social ecology groups such as the Earth Action Network not only called for vastly expanding public parks, wilderness areas, and wildlife habitat, they actively helped organize Redwood Summer and are now organizing other sustained environmental actions involving civil disobedience, direct action, and creative resistance. Note: Earth Action Network Newsletter, October 1990. End note. In Vermont, the Burlington Greens have actively pushed a voter initiative drive for a moratorium on economic development, including development of lucrative lakefront property and ski resorts. They also recently launched a major direct action campaign against a large biotechnology research firm operating within their city. A more unified, more holistic, more integrated radical ecology movement may well be emerging. If so, this movement will be neither anthropocentric nor misanthropic. It will seek both to expand wilderness and create a humane and ecological society. Its vision will balance creative human intervention in nature with humble and caring restraint. Furthermore, this movement will understand and accept ecological and ethical limits to global economic and population growth while seeking sustainable and just development of all societies. It will also seek to break up the modern imperialist system that ravages one human community to advance the interests of another, and, on a more personal level, it will foster the emergence of an ecological sensibility that can ground our lives in a heartfelt sense of connection and communion with the entire world of life. This book points the way towards such an inspiring movement. Happily, it does so in a way that both deep and social ecologists can clearly understand. The integrative perspective evidenced here builds on the strengths of both schools of thought. This book, of course, represents only a beginning, not an ending. It is just one needed step by two influential activists and thinkers. Other voices need to be seriously considered as well. The larger movement, for example, needs to listen well to ecofeminists, black environmentalists, Native Americans, sympathetic union organizers, and third world activists. It would be hard to overestimate the value of this dialogue, however. Together, in this book, Bookchin and Foreman offer provocative and insightful answers to that increasingly important question, whether the radical ecology movement